Picture this. The morning of June 14th, 1940. Paris. A strange, unnatural silence hangs in the air. Usually, at this time of year, the boulevards are alive with the noise of cafes, car horns, and the voices of tourists. But today, there is only one sound. The rhythmic, metallic rumble of thousands of boots striking the cobblestones of the Champs-Élysées. The world watched these images in stunned disbelief. The impossible had happened. France, a nation with one of the strongest armies in Europe, a power that had withstood 4 years of the bloody meat grinder of World War I, had collapsed in just 6 weeks. To an American reporter watching from Berlin, it looked like the end of history. The swastika was flying over the Eiffel Tower. British forces had been pushed into the sea at Dunkirk. Poland had been wiped off the face of the earth. It seemed that the German military machine was a flawless, invincible mechanism that could not be stopped. At that moment, in the summer of 1940, Germany was at the absolute peak of its power. If you look at a map from that time, you will see a gray stain spreading from Warsaw to the Atlantic. Wehrmacht generals were basking in glory. Soldiers were sending postcards home featuring the Arc de Triomphe, confident they would be back by Christmas as victors. Hitler performed his famous little jig of joy. It seemed the war was over. But none of them, not the marching soldiers, not the celebrating generals, nor the Führer himself, noticed one crucial detail. Cracks were already forming in the foundation of this colossal empire. While the world was blinded by the glare of German victories, a mechanism of self-destruction had already been triggered deep within the system. Today, we are not going to talk about politics. We will not discuss the ideology of Nazism, the moral questions, or the horrors of the Holocaust. Enough has been said about that, and history's verdict is unambiguous. Today, we are doing something different. We are performing an autopsy. We are going to look at World War II through the cold eyes of an analyst. We will dissect logistics, geography, and strategy. We will trace the chain of 10 fatal decisions that turned the masters of Europe into inhabitants of ruins. Many historians debate which specific moment was the point of no return. Was it Stalingrad, D-Day, or the entry of the United States into the war? But the truth is, the seeds of defeat were not sown in the cold steppes of Russia or on the beaches of France. The first and perhaps most critical decision was made right when the champagne was flowing in occupied Paris. Germany stood on the shores of the English Channel. In front of them, just 20 miles across the strait, lay Britain, the only remaining enemy. German soldiers could see the white cliffs of Dover through their binoculars. It seemed they only needed to take one more step. But that step was never taken. And instead of finishing one war, Germany decided to start another. The water of the English Channel became a wall that the invincible army could never breach. And this inaction in the summer of 1940 triggered a chain reaction. July 1940. Hitler is sitting in Berlin, waiting. He is waiting for a phone call from London, a telegram, a letter, anything that would signal Britain's capitulation. In his logic, the war is already won. France has fallen. The British army abandoned all its heavy weaponry on the beaches of Dunkirk and fled. What is the point of continuing the resistance? But the phone remains silent. Winston Churchill has no intention of negotiating. And here, the German military machine faces a problem for the first time that cannot be solved by a tank blitzkrieg. A geography problem. Between the German army and London lies the Channel. For the most powerful land army in the world, those 20 miles of water became an unbridgeable chasm. The German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, was a dwarf compared to Britain's Royal Navy. If the Germans had tried to ferry their tanks across on barges, British destroyers would have simply ground them into splinters. Germany had one option left: win air superiority. If the Luftwaffe could destroy the British Air Force, the Royal Navy would be left defenseless, and invasion would be possible. Operation Sea Lion was born. The Battle of Britain began. And here, the first critical strategic shift occurred. Initially, German pilots methodically destroyed British radar stations and airfields. The Royal Air Force was on the brink of collapse. Pilots were sleeping 2 hours a day. There weren't enough planes. The math was on Germany's side. Victory was a matter of weeks. But then, something strange happened. Due to a navigation error, a German bomber accidentally dropped bombs on London. In response, the British launched a daring raid on Berlin. This sent Hitler into a rage. He ordered a change in strategy. Stop attacking the airfields and start bombing the cities. This decision was emotional, not strategic, and it was fatal. While German bombers were leveling the residential quarters of London during the Blitz, the British aviation gained a precious respite. They repaired their runways, fixed their radars, and trained new pilots. When the Luftwaffe returned to air combat, they were met not by exhausted stragglers, but by an organized wall of fire. By September 1940, it was clear. The sky over England did not belong to Germany. Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. From a strategic perspective, this was a catastrophe. Germany left an unsinkable aircraft carrier right behind its back, an island that would become the base for all future Allied operations. Without Britain's survival in 1940, there would be no D-Day, no strategic bombing of German industry, no staging ground for American troops. But in Hitler's headquarters, they saw it differently. They didn't view Britain as a serious threat. Fine, they thought in Berlin. They are sitting on their island and aren't going anywhere. We'll deal with them later. Ignoring Britain created the classic two-front war problem that German strategists had feared since the days of Bismarck. But instead of solving this problem while it was still possible, German command performed a 180-degree turn. They decided that since they couldn't finish the enemy in the west, they needed to find a new enemy in the east. The logic of this decision still baffles many researchers, but for Hitler, it was crystal clear. He believed that Britain was only continuing to resist because it hoped for help from the Soviet Union. And to kill Britain's hope, they had to destroy the USSR. June 22nd, 1941, 3:15 a.m. Along a border stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, artillery opened fire. 3 million German soldiers, thousands of tanks and planes crossed the Soviet border. It was, and remains to this day, the largest military invasion in human history. Operation Barbarossa. If the decision not to invade Britain was an error of inaction, the invasion of the USSR was an error of action. An error of such magnitude that it is difficult to comprehend. Why? Why open a second front while having an undefeated enemy in your rear? The answer lies in a mix of ideological fanaticism and cold economic necessity. Hitler didn't just need living space. He needed the oil of the Caucasus and the grain of Ukraine. Germany was under a British naval blockade, and resources were melting away. To continue the war with the West, Berlin needed the resources of the East. It was a paradox. To win the war, they had to start an even bigger war. In the first weeks, it seemed the gamble had paid off. The Wehrmacht sliced through Soviet defenses like a hot knife through butter. Encirclements near Minsk, Kiev, Smolensk, hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were taken prisoner. General Franz Halder, chief of the Army General Staff, wrote in his diary on July 3rd, "It is no exaggeration to say that the campaign against Russia has been won in 14 days." A phrase that today sounds like an epitaph. The German command had fallen victim to its own propaganda. Hitler once said, "We have only to kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." They believed the USSR was a colossus with feet of clay, inhabited by subhumans, incapable of organization. But they forgot to look at the globe. To understand the problem Germany faced, let's overlay a map of the Eastern Front onto a map of the USA. The distance German troops had to cover from Warsaw to the Volga and the Caucasus is roughly the same as the journey from New York to Kansas City, but without roads, without motels, and with an enemy that burns everything behind them. German logistics were not designed for such distances. There is a popular myth of the Wehrmacht as a fully mechanized army where everyone rides in APCs. This is a lie. In 1941, the vast majority of German logistics relied on horses. Yes, exactly. Hundreds of thousands of horses pulled artillery and supply wagons, and the deeper they went into Russia, the harder it became to feed them. Then came the train problems. German engineers discovered with horror that the railway gauge in the USSR was different from the European one. Trains with ammunition and winter clothes got stuck at the border. They had to be unloaded by hand. The pace of the offensive slowed with every kilometer. Tank wedges drove forward, detaching from the infantry and supplies. Dust clogged the engines. And then the rains came, turning the roads into an impassable mess the Russians call Rasputitsa. By October 1941, the tone of General Halder's diaries had changed radically. There was no trace of euphoria left. Instead of victory in 14 days, there were entries about heavy fighting, exhaustion, and fanatical Russian resistance. They had planned to hold a parade on Red Square before the first frost. Soldiers weren't even issued winter gun oil or warm clothing because, according to the plan, the war was supposed to end in summer. But summer ended, and the rotten structure they planned to kick didn't collapse. On the contrary, it started shooting back with a fury the Germans had never seen in Europe. They thought they had destroyed the Red Army in the border battles. They were wrong, and this mistake was caused not just by bad weather, but by an intelligence failure of cosmic proportions. War is not just shooting. War is mathematics. And in 1941, German mathematics failed fatally. Before the invasion, German intelligence, the Abwehr, prepared a report on the industrial potential of the USSR. Their conclusion was comforting for Hitler. Russian industry is weak, disorganized, and concentrated in the western part of the country. Capture Ukraine and western Russia, and the Red Army will be left without bullets and tanks. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a hallucination. What the Soviet Union did in the summer and autumn of 1941 borders on the impossible. Imagine if the United States, after being attacked on the East Coast, decided to disassemble all of Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Chicago, screw by screw, load them onto trains, and move them past the Rocky Mountains, and then reassemble them in an open field and start production a month later. Sounds like science fiction? The Soviets did exactly that. While German tanks rushed toward Moscow, thousands of trains went east. 1,500 major factories were dismantled and moved to the Urals and Siberia. People worked under the open sky, in minus 30 degrees frost, assembling machines right on the snow. Factory walls were built around equipment that was already running. By 1942, when Germany thought the USSR's industrial backbone was broken, Soviet factories beyond the Urals began churning out weapons on a scale German engineers couldn't even dream of. And here we come to a qualitative difference in philosophies. The German approach to weaponry is engineering art. Their tanks were complex, comfortable, packed with optics and technology. The Tiger is an engineering masterpiece, but to make one Tiger, it took thousands of man-hours of highly skilled labor. The Soviet approach, embodied in the T-34 tank, was different. Rough welding, minimum comfort, simplicity. But while the Germans made one perfect tank, the Russians made 10 good enough ones. In war, quantity has a quality all its own. In August 1941, General Halder admitted the intelligence failure with horror. We counted on encountering 200 enemy divisions. We have already destroyed 200, but intelligence reports that another 200 have appeared in front of us. Germany was trapped in a war of attrition. They were killing enemy soldiers faster than they were losing their own, but the enemy was recovering faster than Germany could reload its guns. The Reich's resources were limited to Europe. The USSR's resources, thanks to the evacuation, were out of reach of German bombers. Blitzkrieg died the moment the war dragged on. Time began to work against Germany. Every day, the chances of victory melted away. To turn the tide, they needed a miracle, or at least the absence of new enemies. But precisely at this critical moment, when the Wehrmacht was freezing near Moscow and the Ural factories were picking up steam, Adolf Hitler made a decision that finally crossed out any hope for a favorable outcome. A decision so irrational that historians still try to understand his motives. December 7th, 1941. Japanese aviation attacks Pearl Harbor. America is in shock. President Roosevelt declares war on Japan. In Berlin, this news was met with mixed feelings. On one hand, Hitler was glad Britain and the US had problems in the Pacific. On the other, he didn't know about the Japanese plans. The Axis allies didn't particularly trust each other and rarely coordinated their actions. And here comes one of the strangest moments in the history of diplomacy. Germany had a treaty with Japan, the Tripartite Pact. But it had an important nuance. The article of the treaty stated that countries were obligated to help each other only if one of them was attacked. But Japan had not been attacked. It had attacked the US itself. Legally, Germany was not obligated to enter the war with America. Hitler could have simply stood aside, watched the US spend resources on a war with Japan on the other side of the globe, and quietly continued to strangle Britain and the USSR. This was the ideal scenario for the Reich. Franklin Roosevelt understood that the main threat to the world came from Berlin, not Tokyo. But the American people were furious, specifically at the Japanese. Congress would never have approved a war with Germany just like that. Roosevelt was tied hand and foot. But on December 11th, 1941, just 4 days after Pearl Harbor, Adolf Hitler takes the podium at the Reichstag and declares war on the United States of America. Why? This decision seems so stupid it's hard to believe. Hitler, whose army was already bogged down in the snows near Moscow, whose aviation couldn't defeat Britain, voluntarily adds the world's largest industrial power to his list of enemies. Historians believe Hitler was guided by two reasons. First, ignorance. He considered Americans cowboys, a soft consumer society incapable of fighting. He believed the US was a paper tiger. The second reason, hope. He hoped that if he supported Japan, Japan would reciprocate by opening a second front against the USSR in Siberia. Both calculations were fatal errors. Japan never attacked the Soviet Union, and America turned out not to be made of paper at all. The entry of the US into the war turned the conflict from a military one into an industrial one. And here, Germany didn't stand a single chance. Just think about the numbers. In 1944, the US produced nearly 100,000 aircraft. Germany, 40,000. But it wasn't just about quantity. It was about resources. American factories worked in safety, under the bright sun, with unlimited access to oil, steel, and rubber. German factories worked under bombs, in conditions of total scarcity. The Ford Willow Run plant in Michigan alone produced one B-24 bomber every hour. Every hour. While you are watching this segment of the video, a new plane would have rolled off the assembly line. From December 11th, 1941, Germany's defeat became a matter of time. The math of war stopped adding up. 3 of the planet's greatest powers united against the Axis: the human resources of the USSR, the navy and intelligence of Britain, and the infinite industrial power of the US. It would seem that in such a situation, one needs to change strategy. Shift to deep defense. Look for political exits. But the German management system by this moment had already degraded to the level of a personal dictatorship of one man. A man who was increasingly losing touch with reality. After the failure near Moscow in the winter of 1941, Hitler drew a conclusion, but not the one a rational person would draw. Instead of admitting logistical errors, he accused the generals of cowardice. In December, he fires the commander-in-chief of the army, Walter von Brauchitsch, and announces, "From now on, I will lead this army myself." From this moment, the war turned into a one-man show. A man who only reached the rank of corporal in World War I was now moving armies on a map, ignoring the advice of professionals who had studied strategy their whole lives. The Wehrmacht's command system, once flexible and encouraging of initiative on the ground, was paralyzed. Now, to move a tank division from one flank to another, a general at the front had to call the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia. Often, the decision arrived with a 24-hour delay. In modern warfare, that is an eternity. The culmination of this madness was Stalingrad. In the summer of 1942, the German army was rushing toward the oil of the Caucasus. But Hitler became obsessed with the city on the Volga, not because of its strategic value, but because of its name. Stalingrad. Capturing the city named after Stalin became a matter of honor. The Germans entered the city, turning it into ruins. The fighting began for every house, for every floor. Rattenkrieg, Rat War, as the soldiers called it. The Wehrmacht, designed for maneuvering in open fields, got stuck in concrete labyrinths. And while Friedrich Paulus's Sixth Army was slowly grinding itself down in urban battles, the Soviet command was preparing a trap. Operation Uranus, strikes against the weak Romanian and Italian flanks. On November 23, 1942, the pincers snapped shut. 300,000 German soldiers were caught in the Kessel, cauldron. Paulus had a chance. In the first days of the encirclement, he still had fuel and strength to strike out and break through. Generals begged Hitler to give the order for a breakout, but Hitler, looking at a map thousands of kilometers from the front, said no. He forbade retreat. Instead, Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, promised to supply the encircled army by air. "We will create an air bridge," he declared. It was a lie. The math was ignored again. For the army to survive, it needed 700 tons of supplies a day. The Luftwaffe, straining every muscle, delivered 100 on its best days. Soldiers in the cauldron began dying, not from bullets, but from cold and starvation. They ate horses, then leather belts. Discipline collapsed. Meanwhile, radiograms continued to arrive from Berlin about promotions and medals that were now worthless. In January 1943, Paulus, realizing his men were doomed, sent a final request for surrender to save the survivors. Hitler's reply went down in history as an example of absolute cynicism. He promoted Paulus to field marshal. The implication was transparent. No German field marshal had ever surrendered alive. Hitler expected Paulus to shoot himself, but Paulus chose life. On February 2, 1943, the remnants of the Sixth Army surrendered. Of the 90,000 prisoners, only 6,000 would return home after the war. Stalingrad was not just a military defeat. It broke the psychological spine of the German army. The myth of invincibility was drowned in the icy waters of the Volga. The no-step-back order, intended to strengthen the army's spirit, became its curse. It deprived generals of their main weapon, maneuver. The German army turned into a static target, methodically destroyed by Soviet artillery. But the problem wasn't just how they fought. The problem was where they fought. Let's step away from the battles for a second and look at the map of Europe in 1943. If you are a strategist, this map should give you a panic attack. German troops are scattered over a territory 3 times the size of Germany itself. This is a classic example of imperial overstretch. Imagine a rubber band. If you stretch it, it covers a large area. But the harder you pull, the thinner it gets. At some point, it becomes transparent. And then, it snaps. That is exactly what was happening to the Wehrmacht. Hitler wanted to control everything. He sent the elite Africa Corps under Erwin Rommel to the deserts of North Africa. Why? To save his incompetent ally Mussolini. As a result, instead of concentrating a fist on the Eastern Front, Germany wasted precious fuel, tanks, and its best soldiers fighting for the sands of Libya and Tunisia. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers eventually surrendered in Tunisia in May 1943, a disaster comparable in scale to Stalingrad, but far less talked about. Look at the West. Hitler ordered the construction of the Atlantic Wall, a giant line of fortifications from Spain to Norway. Millions of tons of concrete and steel, which could have gone into building factories or tanks, were poured into bunkers on the coast. Inside these bunkers, dozens of divisions sat for years, staring at an empty ocean, waiting for an invasion that only came in 1944. And finally, the most absurd example, Norway. Hitler was paranoid that the British would invade there. Throughout the war, an army of up to 400,000 men was stationed there. 400,000 well-equipped soldiers. They went fishing, marched, and got bored. When Soviet tanks were storming Berlin, this huge army was still sitting in the fjords. They were useless. Germany tried to plug every hole with its fingers, but it simply ran out of fingers. When the Allies landed in Italy, Germans had to pull divisions from the Eastern Front and send them south. When the Allies landed in Normandy, Germans had to tear themselves into 3 parts. Every new front meant the line of defense got thinner. The German soldier of 1944 is no longer the energetic conqueror from the posters of 40. He is an exhausted man who hasn't slept in 3 days, running out of ammo, knowing no reinforcements are coming, because reserves were sent to plug a hole 1,000 kilometers away. Logistics finally collapsed. Trains going to Italy were bombed by Americans. Trains going to Russia were blown up by partisans. By 1944, Germany was in a situation of Zugzwang. Any move leads to a worse position. They lacked men, lacked oil, lacked steel. Winning this war by traditional methods was no longer possible. A rational leader at this moment would have started surrender negotiations to save the nation from total annihilation. But the Nazi leadership lived in a world of illusions. They convinced themselves, and tried to convince the people, that salvation would come not from strategy, but from technology. That any day now, German genius would reveal something to the world that would flip the chessboard. September 8th, 1944. Residents of London heard a strange double bang. First, an explosion destroyed an entire block in Chiswick, and only then, seconds later, came the whistling sound of the object approaching. It seemed like a violation of the laws of physics. The sound of the explosion arrived before the sound of flight. The world had encountered the ballistic missile for the first time, the V-2 Vergeltungswaffe 2. From an engineering standpoint, it was a triumph. Wernher von Braun created a machine that flew into space long before Gagarin and Apollo. It was 1960s technology available in the 1940s. German propaganda screamed, "The wonder weapon will save the Reich. We will wipe London off the face of the earth with the push of a button." But if you take off the glasses of technical enthusiasm and put on the glasses of an economist, the V-2 was a disaster. The program to develop these missiles cost Germany roughly the same amount the US spent on the Manhattan Project, the creation of the atomic bomb. But let's compare the results. The atomic bomb ended the war in a week. The V-2 rockets, despite their futuristic nature, dropped less explosives on London than conventional Allied aviation dropped on Germany in a single raid. Germany spent billions of Reichsmarks, tons of scarce aluminum, and thousands of engineers to create a very expensive way to deliver conventional explosives. It was like buying a Ferrari to deliver pizza. It's impressive, but economically absurd. Moreover, the production of these rockets hides one of the darkest pages of the war. They were assembled by slaves in the underground factories of Dora Mittelbau. Conditions were so inhumane that around 20,000 prisoners died from starvation, disease, and executions. The attacks on London killed about 5,000 people. It is a unique case in the history of weaponry. It killed 4 times more of its own creators than enemies. The same story happened in the sky. The Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first jet fighter. It was faster than any Allied plane by 100 miles per hour. American pilots in Mustangs felt like they were standing still. If this plane had appeared in the sky in 1943 as an interceptor, it could have stopped the bombing of Germany. But Hitler intervened again. He looked at this sleek fighter and asked, "Can it carry bombs?" The engineers replied, "Theoretically, yes, mein Führer, but it will ruin the aerodynamics." Hitler didn't care. He ordered the world's best fighter to be converted into a mediocre high-speed bomber. Precious months were lost on conversion. When Hitler finally came to his senses and allowed it to be used as a fighter, it was too late. Germany had run out of fuel. Brand new jet planes sat on airfields, turning into convenient targets for American aviation because they simply had nothing to put in their tanks. The whole concept of Wunderwaffe was a strategic error. Germany was looking for a silver bullet, a magic pill that would solve all problems at once. They built giant tanks like the King Tiger or the monstrous Mouse, which broke bridges with their weight and guzzled fuel by the barrel. Meanwhile, Americans and Russians stamped out Shermans and T-34s. They were simple, reliable, and there were many of them. Very many. While German mechanics were fixing the complex transmission of one Tiger in the field, 10 Shermans drove past. German obsession with technological superiority played a cruel joke on them. They forgot that wars are won, not by prototypes, but by mass production. But even when rockets fell off target and jets didn't take off, the bunker under Berlin refused to face the truth. The war was lost. Everyone understood this. But precisely at this moment, the most irrational, bloody phase of the conflict began. By late 1944, the outcome of the war was obvious, even to the most fanatical Nazis. The Allies had liberated France and stood on the Reich's border. The Red Army was sweeping away Army Group Center and entering East Prussia. Oil was gone. Factories lay in ruins. In any normal war, this is the moment a government asks for negotiations. The goal of any state is the survival of the nation. If victory is impossible, you must save what is left: people, infrastructure, cities. But the Third Reich was not a normal state, and its end became an act of national suicide unseen in modern history. Instead of surrender, Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine turned on total war mode. They instilled one thought in Germans: surrender is worse than death. If the Russians come, they will kill everyone. Fear became the main fuel of resistance. German soldiers on the Eastern Front fought with the desperation of the doomed, simply to buy time for refugees fleeing to the West. But there was another fear: fear of their own. In the final months of the war, Germany was engulfed by a wave of internal terror. Special SS units and field police roamed the rear looking for deserters. Anyone retreating without orders or simply looking insufficiently resolute could be labeled a deserter. On the lampposts of Berlin and Vienna, the bodies of hanged soldiers swung with signs on their chests. "I betrayed my Führer." When they ran out of soldiers, the regime began throwing children and the elderly into the furnace of war. The Volkssturm, the People's Militia, was created. Picture this scene. Berlin, April 1945. A boy from the Hitler Youth sits in a trench. He is 14 years old. He was given a Panzerfaust, a disposable grenade launcher that weighs almost as much as he does. Next to him is a 60-year-old World War I veteran, pulled from his home and handed a rifle. They were ordered to stop Marshal Zhukov's tank army. This was not a military decision. It was a human sacrifice. Thousands of teenagers died in senseless street battles, trying to knock out tanks that no longer decided anything. But the most terrible betrayal was committed by Adolf Hitler himself. On March 19, 1945, he issued a decree known as the Nero Decree. Its logic was terrifying in its simplicity. Hitler decided that if the German people were losing the war, it meant they turned out to be too weak and did not deserve a future. The future belonged to the stronger Eastern people. Therefore, upon leaving, Germans had to destroy everything. Blow up bridges, dams, power plants, factories, food warehouses. Hitler wanted to leave the victors and his own surviving population, a scorched wasteland. Germany was to be thrown back into the Stone Age. Fortunately, Minister of Armaments Albert Speer, realizing the madness of this order, sabotaged its execution. But even without the Nero decree, the destruction was colossal. On May 8, 1945, when the guns finally fell silent, Europe saw what these 10 fatal decisions had led to. Germany hadn't just lost, it ceased to exist as a state. Cities were turned into lunar landscapes of broken brick. Millions of men were in captivity or in graves. The country was divided into occupation zones. It was Stunde Null, Hour Zero, total collapse. So, which of these 10 decisions was the fatal one? Refusing to invade Britain? Invading the Soviet Union? Declaring war on America? Micromanaging generals? Stubbornness at Stalingrad? Faith in wonder weapons? The answer is none of them, and all of them together. There was no single decisive failure. War is a complex system. You cannot simply pull out one element, like a cork from a bottle, and expect everything to collapse. Germany's defeat in World War II is the result of a systemic error that lies deeper than the miscalculations of generals or intelligence failures. The main cause of the catastrophe is the rejection of rationality, the substitution of logic with ideology, the belief that one can disregard geography, mathematics, and economics if one has a higher purpose. Hitler believed he was a Superman allowed to do anything. He spat on the advice of professionals, ignored the warnings of economists, and despised those who pointed out uncomfortable facts. He thought he could cheat the laws of nature, the laws of economics, and the laws of war. But the laws proved stronger. Germany fell victim to its own hubris. They overestimated their strength and underestimated the strength of their enemies. They thought they could conquer the world in a few months. And when it became clear that this was impossible, they preferred to die rather than admit their mistake. This story is not just a lesson in military strategy. It is a lesson on how dangerous it is when power is concentrated in the hands of one man who believes in his own infallibility. Empires do not crumble from external enemies. Empires crumble from within, from the madness of leaders, from the corruption of elites, from faith in false ideals. Summer 1940. Paris. Triumph. Germany stands at the summit of the world. But it was at that very moment that the clock started ticking, and every subsequent decision brought the inevitable collapse closer. You know, while I was preparing this material, one thing struck me the most. We used to think of Nazi Germany as some kind of perfect, oiled machine of destruction. But if we remove the propaganda and look at the numbers, we will see chaos. For me, the main lesson of this story is not military, but psychological. You can't beat math with slogans. You can't ignore reality just because you don't like it. Hitler and his entourage built a system where loyalty was valued above the truth, and that's what ultimately ruined them. Reality always wins. And this is perhaps the most sobering conclusion of the Second World War.